Remember this car? Last time you saw it, it was in undercoat, had a few mechanical things to touch up. We'd just taken it to Luddenham Raceway for a bit of a shakedown on the Nexus install that we did here at Haltech. This was one of the first Nexus circuit cars that we had in for testing. Well, it's obviously been to the panel shop, looks amazing. Today, it's here for some closed loop boost control. It was about this time last year that we were working on this Nexus development car, a Nissan R35 VR38 powered monster. This was the one that we lovingly referred to as the R35 GTST. That's because it's got a sequential gearbox, it's rear wheel drive, the transaxle's gone. A lot of that stuff can be seen in the videos that Davo and I did when we did the full Nexus wire up in this car. So in case you haven't caught that, we'll put that in the links below. Have a bit of a look at that whole build series so you can see us go step by step in the whole wiring process of this car. So for a quick refresher of what we're dealing with here today, this thing is a Nissan R35 GTR, but does have some differences. Looks pretty similar in here, the Nissan VR38 engine, but as we outlined in the other video series, Brian, the guy that owns this car, has also got an R35 track car in factory form. So that's the one that's got the transaxle with the GR6 gearbox all at the back, the flappy paddles, all that stuff. He wanted this track car to be a little bit different, so he went for a sequential, manually shifted gearbox up the top. It's got an R33 Skyline style rear end in it, so it's got a conventional differential in the back. He's kind of brought it back to a traditional style race car. When Davo and I originally did the wire up and the tuning on this car, it was the first time that the engine had been fired up after having all this fabrication work done. So we got it on the dyno, we ran it up, we put a list of things together that needed to be touched up before the thing could go and compete competitively. One of those things was the wastegate springs. So this thing has got a factory engine and it's got upgraded turbochargers. There's a reason for that. So Brian's using this engine as the mock-up to get the whole car dialed in, get the tune-up on song, get the suspension sorted, get the flat shift throttle blipping of the sequential gearbox sorted. Then, when that's all under control, he'll drop in his big banger engine. But the factory form VR38's nothing to laugh at. This thing is making very, very healthy power. In fact, when we did the run-in setup on this car, the problem we had was that the wastegate springs were too big and we were actually making too much power. In factory form, the VR38 engine makes around 300 kilowatts at all four wheels. When this thing first turned up, it had about 20 pounds of wastegate spring in it. So the way that I actually managed to bring the power down in the car was by controlling the dual electronic throttle body so that when Brian hit the throttle flat to the floor, those throttle blades were only opening to about 35%. Not an ideal way of doing it, but when they were all the tools in the toolbox, that's all we had left. It needed to get to the racetrack. That's the way we got it done. Since then, it's been back to the workshop. They've fitted some 12-pound wastegate springs in it. So now we can go back through and we can set up some boost by gear and we can set up some mapped out boost levels. The way we're going to do that is on our keypad inside the car. So we've got a keypad in there that works as like a rotary trim. We press that button, boost goes up and up and up until we have a whole bunch of fun. But before we get into all of that stuff, let's go inside. This thing's had a lot of work done since you would have seen it last. So come in, have a look around. It has been finished off really, really well. This is one of my absolute favorite circuit cars. Well, inside is just as impressive as the exterior of this car. When you're sitting in the pilot seat, we've got the beautiful Haltech IC7 dash right in front of us. We've got our reverse camera just to the left here. We've got the 15-button keypad that's controlling all of the stuff that we need to do while we're driving. It's also got this beautiful steering wheel that's got the buttons off the steering wheel, that then it's got the little transmitter off the bottom here, across to a little Bluetooth module, then into the engine management system. It's got the Hollinger flat shift load cell gear knob up the top here. It's got the Albin sequential gearbox down the bottom. But what's crazy in this car, what's so impressive is the carbon absolutely everywhere. The carbon dash, carbon center console, carbon doors, the roof's carbon. Like, this is a beautiful race car and it's so well prepared. So this was the guys at Peruzic Engineering are the ones that are responsible for finishing off this car and making it as nice as it is. The guys actually made the pedal box in it themselves. Fantastic engineering job, this car. When you see it in person, you realize that all the roll cage, the seats, every single part in it is really well thought out so that it's so easy to work on. And like all of these things, the more work that's been put into it, the simpler it looks. And that's the case in this car. You get in and think, oh yeah, it's functional, that makes sense. It's just simple and it just works. This is also the car we used to do the Bosch Motorsport ABS CAN integration. That means that the Bosch ABS system in this car communicates back and forward with the Haltech ECU, sharing the G-sensor data, sharing all of the wheel slip percentages, individual wheel speeds, and how the traction control system's functioning. So it gives us what level the ABS is working at, how aggressive it's working if we've had a slip event. All of that data goes into the Nexus ECU so that we can data log it and give the driver the feedback when they come back to the pits. Well, that's enough about the car. It's here today to do the power management stuff. So what Brian's after is we've got a button on the dash here, on the keypad, boost. It's got position 0, position 1, position 2, position 3. What he wants to do is have a different power level each time I press this button. So like we said before, factory these engines made about 300 kilowatts at all 4 wheels. So he's looking for about 300 kilowatts on wastegate pressure. Then we'll bump it up by sort of about 30 kilowatts every time we press the button. And we're going to do that because, well, Brian wants to shake the car down when he's at the racetrack. He wants to be able to let some of his friends drive it, hopefully me, and he also wants to have different wet weather conditions. So if it's really cold, if it's wet, if there's a bit of sleet, so that he can at least have different power management as well as different traction control strategies and different ABS profiles. One thing I am a little bit nervous about is that the guys have fitted some 12-pound wastegate springs to this thing, and Brian's asked for a wastegate pressure or wastegate power of about 300-ish kilowatts, something like that. It's got big turbochargers on it. It's a 3.8 litre engine. I'm nervous that even on wastegate pressure, this is going to make more power than the lowest power that we're going to want. So I'm so glad the thing's got electronic throttle bodies on it. First task, 0 wastegate. We'll give it a run and see how much power it makes. Well, it's not every day that you make 400 kilowatts or 545 horsepower at the wheels and you're somewhat disappointed. And I say that because I actually want the wastegate pressure to be a lower horsepower than that. So this on wastegate pressure, so 12-pound wastegate springs, this thing is making 406 kilowatts at the rear wheels. Before we go any further, we probably should start at the very beginning here. I keep talking about a wastegate and a wastegate spring, but we need to understand what that is before we can start talking about boost control. To start at the beginning, remember your turbocharger is connected to your engine's exhaust system. The exhaust comes out of the engine through the turbocharger's exhaust housing, through the turbine wheel, then out into the exhaust. If we put as much exhaust that comes out of the engine straight through that turbine wheel and out the exhaust, we're going to make as much boost as that turbocharger will possibly make. And that's not, well, it's fun, but it's not what we really want in every application. We really want to have a way of directing how much exhaust goes through that turbine wheel and how much gets dumped straight down into the exhaust system or through a screamer pipe straight on the ground under the engine. And that is where the wastegate comes in. The wastegate's job is to direct those exhaust gases either through the exhaust turbine wheel or straight out the exhaust, bypassing the turbocharger altogether. Why would you want to do this? Well, to regulate the turbine speed, thus regulating the boost pressure. So in this car, we've got 12-pound wastegate springs. So what that means is that when our manifold pressure reaches 12 pounds, our wastegates are going to start to open and they're going to regulate that pressure so that we get 12 pounds of manifold boost pressure. That's a fixed boost pressure. There's a few different styles of wastegates. There's an internal flapper style pneumatic wastegate. That's the one that's got the flapper built into the exhaust housing of your turbocharger. That could also be electronically operated. Then we've got external wastegates. We've got electronic external wastegates and we've got pneumatically controlled external wastegates. This particular car has got a pneumatically controlled external wastegate, and that's the one we're going to be talking about. The wastegate has a valve built into it with a spring, then it has a pressure source from the engine's inlet manifold on the top, so a reference pressure source. Basically how this works is if we say, let's say we put what we call a 12-pound spring in it, which is what this has got, we've got a manifold reference on the wastegate, then as the engine starts building boost pressure, that manifold pressure overcomes the spring pressure in the wastegate, the valve lifts, in turn allowing exhaust to bypass the turbine, head straight out the exhaust as wasted gas. By doing this, the turbine slows down, our boost pressure slows down, then that valve will end up sort of opening and shutting, regulating that manifold pressure to the wastegate spring pressure. That's exactly what just happened here. So with no electric interference whatsoever, I held the throttle flat to the floor, did a power run. On the dyno here, we can see that it built up to 12 pounds of boost pressure. That valve would have been going out of control, holding that boost nice and flat. So now we know our spring pressure in this car is 12 pounds and it makes an absolutely incredible 400 kilowatts at the wheels. Now this car has actually turned out to be an excellent test car because it's got electronic throttles on it as well. And normally I wouldn't be able to lower the full throttle power of this car under that wastegate pressure. But because this has got electronic throttles, I can now show you two things at once. We can limit the engine power based on the throttle angle. Then to make more power than that, we can bleed manifold pressure reference off the wastegates in order to that valve to lift a little bit later on in order to make more boost pressure. Now, knowing that this thing makes 12 pounds on the wastegate springs, there's no way that I can make those wastegates open any earlier. So the only tool that I've got in the toolbox is to physically open the throttle blades less as the driver hits the thing flat to the floor. So when you press the throttle flat to the floor, normally the throttles on the engine would go to 100%. But what I'm going to do here to limit the power, I'm going to make it so that when I press my foot flat to the floor, the throttle blades on the engine only open up to about 35% throttle. I'll do a power run, see how much power it's then got at the wheels and see whether that's going to be acceptable to put onto our trim switch here to limit the power so that Brian can have several different power levels at the wheels. This is traditionally not how you're sort of supposed to do this job. You would typically install, say, a 4 or a 6 pound wastegate spring into both the wastegates that are on the engine. In this case, the wastegates are in a crazy place to get to, very, very complicated to pull those springs out. And if we do put, say, a 6 pound wastegate spring in them in the first place, that means that we'll only be able to sort of maybe go, if we, depending on how we plumb those wastegates, the most simple method typically allows you to double the boost of the wastegate spring. So let's say this has got 12 pound wastegate springs in it. By bleeding off all of that manifold pressure reference, you can normally end up with a maximum boost pressure of about 24 pounds, about double, until that valve starts to open by itself. If we do a sort of top to bottom method, so there's a different style where we can bleed manifold pressure off the bottom of the wastegate to the top of the wastegate to try and hold it shut. That's another plumbing method, and that'll allow us to get about 1.5 times the wastegate spring pressure. If we go and fit, let's say, a 4 pound or a 6 pound wastegate spring, that does limit our maximum boost pressure. And when this car gets fitted with an engine that's got forged pistons and billet conrods, we do want to end up winding the boost up to 30 plus pounds. So that's not really going to help us then. The way to do this, limiting the throttle blades now, It's a really nice, simple way to do things, and it's not too confusing for the driver because of the flexibility of the keypad and the Nexus ECU. This button here that I've got set up as the boost button, I can now change that. It doesn't have to be boost, it can be just our power level button. When I've got that on position 0, that can target, say, a boost pressure of, well, 12 pounds, the lowest that it can possibly be, but it can have a second task on that same single button by changing our multiple maps for our maximum throttle position. So when I put that on level 1, or level 0 I should say, which means no lights on at all, our maximum throttle angle under boost is going to be 35%. Then, if I put it on number 1, I'll open the throttle a little bit more. If I put it on throttle number 2, I'll open it to, say, 100% throttle and get out 400 kilowatts. Then, if I put it on position number 3, the top one up here, that might then use our closed loop boost control, will increase the target boost pressure up to whatever it needs to make, say, around 440 kilowatts, which is kind of the top power level we're aiming for, and the throttle would be wide open. So this is probably a really good example of using the keypads or using inputs of the ECU to influence multiple maps within the engine management system. So we're making a little bit of progress here. That pull just then, I've got it on the data log here. So if I drag across there, you'll be able to see that on the other page there. So my pedal position was at 100% along that whole pull, but my throttle body position was only at 36, 37, 38, 39%. I've had to map that back in order to achieve that power of 313 kilowatts or 420 horsepower. Up the top here, manifold pressure versus boost pressure. So my manifold pressure, in order to achieve that power, which is bloody good power for 6 pounds of manifold pressure, this engine also has boost pressure sensors. So a boost pressure sensor is mounted between the turbocharger and the throttle blade. A manifold pressure sensor is mounted between the throttle blade and the intake valve. So what this is showing us is that I've got 6 pounds of intake manifold pressure, but I've got 10 pounds of boost pressure. That throttle body is limiting the pressure that's coming into the engine. So you can see that we really are restricting the engine by running it at a 35-ish% throttle blade opening, but you got to do what you got to do. Next up, I'm going to try and add another 30 or 40 kilowatts to be able to be into position number 1 on the boost or on the power level switch. And again, we've had a little bit more success. So we've picked up about 30 kilowatts at the wheels, one press of the button. That's exactly what I was after. All I've done is increase it so that at full throttle, we've now got 45% throttle opening instead of 35% throttle opening. That's given us that extra power. If we look at the line across the top here, we can see that we've now got 10 pounds of boost pressure. So that's the pressure in the intake pipe. And we've got about 8 pounds of inlet manifold pressure. Remembering that the last run and this run, we've still got 0% duty cycle on that solenoid that's on the wastegate. And I probably need to start going into that now. So when I say 0% duty cycle, we've got a pneumatic solenoid, a 3-port boost control solenoid that's connected in between the manifold pressure reference and our wastegate. It's that valve's job to determine whether the manifold pressure makes it to the wastegate or whether it gets bypassed back into the intake just after the air filter. The reason why we do it like this is so that our engine management system can send a pulse out to that solenoid and determine how much air to bleed off that wastegate. If we bleed off 100% of the manifold reference, that means that we're going to make as much boost as we possibly can until the pressure in the exhaust system overcomes the wastegate spring and the valve starts to open. That's what we spoke about before. We've only been able to bleed off so much gas before that wastegate eventually opens and bypasses that wastegate spring. The reason why we're talking about this is because so far we've run this thing at our wastegate pressure. We've run it with very close throttle angle, with a little bit more throttle angle. Now we're finally up to the closed loop boost control strategy that we can actually start talking about the thing that we're supposed to be talking about. Remember the first run that we did, that was 100% throttle opening, and that was our wastegate pressure of 12 PSI. We made 400 or 410 odd kilowatts. I already know that that's the power level it was going to make on that wastegate pressure, and that's the pressure I'm going to put in for our switch position number 2 here. So all we need to do now is use our closed loop boost control strategy and map out position number 3, the big banger. So position number 3, I'm going to go down into our maps here and ensure that I've got 100% throttle opening. I typically put these at 98%. Personal preference, I like to do it like that because I don't want the motor driving 100% wide open. Some electronic throttle blades actually go over center, so they'll actually start shutting, where you might find that 96 or 98% is true wide open. It's such a small thing to do. I don't really think it matters either way. I think it's just good practice. Now let's go through our closed loop boost control strategy, starting from the very beginning here. Then we'll do a practical example, show how the system works, show how the closed loop system works, how the short-term and long-term trims work. Then you'll be able to set up your own boost control. And the first setting, closed loop or open loop boost control. Open loop boost control basically means that we're putting in a bleed style duty cycle on a 3D table. The tuner puts that number in. They might say bleed off 50% across every RPM point and every manifold pressure. And that's the end of that. It's set and forget. There is no external influence on that. The engine management system is not doing any boost targeting, nothing like that. It's an open loop, a basic or a simple form of boost control. Think of it like an electronic bleed tap. Open the tap halfway, that's all there is to it. Closed loop means that, yes, we still have that table. So we still have, let's say, that 50% bleed table, but we also have a target pressure sitting behind that. So the tuner types in, yep, I'll bleed off 50%. That's going to get me to 14 pounds, my target pressure, done. Then we set a target pressure of 14 PSI. If the engine management system sees that the manifold pressure is not at 14 PSI, it goes into what we call our closed loop state. It will then adjust that 50% duty cycle up and down all by itself in order to achieve that target for you. So this is something beautiful about the engine management system being smart. It can see the target and it does whatever it takes to attain that boost target for us. That's what closed loop is. Closed loop idle control. We type in that we want 1,000 RPM to idle. If it's idling a little bit too low or a little bit too high, that closed loop strategy kicks in and allows us to meet our targets. Our closed loop O2 control. Air fuel ratio, we want to target a particular air fuel ratio. If we can't meet that ratio, the closed loop O2 strategy will come in and meet that target. So closed loop refers to something where the engine management system has a target and the engine management system is doing whatever it can to achieve that target. And the good news is, if you've got a Haltech Elite Series ECU, so an Elite 550, 750, 950, 1000, 2000, 1500, 2500, or a Nexus Series ECU, they all do closed loop. So they all have their inbuilt closed loop strategies. Very important to ask for that when you're buying your engine management system. Our controlled parameter. What pressure do you want to control with your closed loop strategy? You might want to control your inlet manifold pressure. That's what we're going to be doing, and that's the most common style. You might want to control your boost pressure. So that's means that you're actually controlling or you're regulating the pressure before the throttle blade. Or you might want to do your wastegate hat pressure. Now don't get this is a little bit confusing. That's typically used when we're doing sort of drag racing with our CO2 boost control strategies. A little bit different there. So what that's doing is instead of using our manifold pressure, so our engine manifold pressure as the pressure reference, we actually have a compressed bottle of CO2 in the car. It might have, say, 80 or 100 PSI of pressure. We use that pressure as our reference for the wastegate. Then we use our closed loop strategy in order to choose how much CO2 to apply to that wastegate. We will do a video about that. That's a completely different animal. We're not going to go into that on this car because we don't have any of that system set up on a car like this. That's more of a drag racing thing. Our output frequency, 33 Hertz. We're using the Haltech boost control solenoid. It's a traditional Mac valve, 33 Hertz. That means that this thing can operate at 33 times a second. Our minimum and maximum duty cycle. So how the minimum that our solenoid can physically pulse, so we might say that we will limit it at 0 and 100%. Sometimes you might want to choose to let your solenoid pulse at, say, 20% duty cycle to 80% duty. You might want to sort of narrow up that range in order to get that control really, really tight. For the majority of cases, 0 to 100% is fine. Our control point offset. This is used, so let's say we're targeting, we'll use this car as an example. I want to use 14 pounds is what I want to target. If we set our control point offset at, let's change that to an equal number of, say, 7 pounds, that means that the engine is going to come up, it's going to come on boost, it's going to come up, and it's going to come up to 7 pounds of boost pressure. Then that's within 7 pounds of our 14-pound target. So control point offset, we need to be within this amount of our target until the closed loop strategy will start to work. Our max derivative. Now this is a confusing one. This is basically asking, okay, as our boost comes on, we want our manifold pressure to stabilize before we start a closed loop strategy. So how many PSI per second can the manifold pressure be changing by before we can start using the control strategy? I'm saying 14 pounds per second. This could be 20 pounds per second, 30 pounds per second. It's not 30 pounds. Remembering that, this is a really tricky thing to understand of that derivative. So how many PSI per second? So as it ramps on really strong, this engine might put on 20 PSI or 30 PSI per second. And if that was the case, it'd be ramping on too aggressively from our closed loop strategy to do anything. So we would sort of want to say, we want it to be accelerating at no more than 14 PSI per second until we can start our closed loop strategy. Our overboost offset. If we go over our target by more than 7 pounds, the output will turn off, the boost will fall over, then only once we come down below our boost control target will the boost controller become active again and try and meet its target. This is to stop over boosting. Really good, especially when we're tuning it, but more so when the car gets out on the road. If anything ever happens, so a line pops off or a solenoid fails or anything like that, this will be able to help protect us as well as our overboost cut. The next tab that we've got here is our spool assist button. I'm not going to turn this on in this car because this car comes on really aggressively. But what I do, if I turn this button on, what that does is when we're below our control point offset, we've got a choice. Do we either want that solenoid to be doing nothing at all, it'll shut, and the boost will come on nice and smooth and away we go? Or if we do the spool assist function, when we're below our target by the control point offset, it'll hold that solenoid at 100%. It'll try and make as much boost as it possibly can until it gets within 7 pounds of the target. Then it'll go to our start duty cycle. Further down here, closed loop minimum throttle position. below this throttle position, the engine management system will work in an open loop style strategy because at 10 or 20 or 40 or 60% throttle, our throttle blade is restricting the boost pressure and it's not consistent enough there in order for us to do closed loop boost control. It's only once we go above about 75% throttle that the manifold pressure becomes consistent and all of a sudden we can start doing our closed loop strategy. The next few settings we're not going to be using on this car because we're going to be doing the closed loop boost control target in a little bit of a different way. We're going to be doing that off the keypad up here, but we've basically got an arming switch so you can choose to turn the boost control strategy on or off. A boost trim, so you might have like an adjustable potentiometer style trim, so you might want to have it the lowest boost and the highest put on a trim knob sort of style thing, or a scramble boost button. We might end up using that later on in this car. Scramble boost is typically a circuit racing thing. You press the button, it says, all right, you add 3 pounds of boost pressure and you can hold that button down for 5 seconds or 10 seconds or as long as you like. So basically what the scramble boost button is doing is allowing you to have an over boost condition for a certain amount of time. Some racing categories allow you to do this, or on the street, you might know that your engine can cop an extra 10 pounds, but only for a few seconds, so be careful with the scramble boost button. Now that we've had a look at the settings for the boost control strategy, we get down to the mapping part of it. The first one here, closed loop base duty cycle. I'm going to talk about this at, say, 12 pounds. First of all, we know this car, the wastegate pressure is 12 pounds. If we have no boost control intervention, it runs 12 pounds of boost pressure. So if I have a look along this table here, at 2,000, 3,000, at all the RPM points, 0% duty cycle, no bleed whatsoever on that wastegate solenoid gives us 12 pounds of boost pressure. If I come across here to 14 pounds, I'm going to have a guess at this and we're going to run this up in a second and see the closed loop strategy working. But I'm going to guess at 12% bleed. So what that means that our solenoids will be pulsing and bleeding off 12% of the air available to them. That it's going to make 14 pounds of boost pressure. Typically, as we rev the engine, we're going to bleed a little bit more off in order to maintain a flat boost curve. If we were trying to target 16 pounds of boost pressure, we might want to bleed off, say, 17 to 19% duty cycle. At 18 pounds, we'd need to bleed off a little bit more. If we were trying to target, say, 30 pounds, 35 pounds, we might need to bleed off 100% to get unlimited boost out of this thing, or you know, I shouldn't say unlimited, the most boost we can possibly get out of this wastegate plumbing system. Next, our target pressure. That's going to be a little bit different on this one. So I'm going to go up here down the bottom. We've got the 4th dimension of our axes along the bottom of the table. So if I just press F3, I can see that this table is throttle position versus gear versus our boost control. So that's versus our boost or our power button that's on the dash here. If I go to level 3, I'm going to be trying to target 14 PSI across every throttle position and in every gear. Now, circuit cars tend to like having a different boost pressure in each gear, as well as a different boost pressure depending on the throttle position as well. So at part throttle going mid-corner, sometimes they don't want full power, and they'll find that the car's a little bit jerky or a bit surgy. So they might want to have 8 or 10 pounds of boost pressure, for example, at part throttle. Then at full throttle, they'll want 14 pounds. On a street car, typically everyone wants the most amount of boost pressure possible all the time. Our controller start delay. Now, once we've hit the throttle, once we've come into boost, that means that our controller is going to start working. It's going to go to our base duty cycle values. It's going to stay at our base duty cycle value for, let's say, where we are here, 3 seconds or 2.5 seconds. So it's going to be in open loop, looking at our base duty cycle for 2.5 seconds. Then it'll be allowed to go into the closed loop strategy. This is, again, to help the boost stabilize before the closed loop controller can start working. The next 3, our proportional, our integral, and our derivative gains. These are magic values. They're really not. Proportional, integral, and derivative, or PID controlling, is how any sort of closed loop strategy works. What it's looking at, the proportional gain, Really, basically, what that's doing is when the boost comes on, if we're targeting, let's say we're targeting 20 pounds, if the boost comes on and it aggressively goes over 20 pounds, under, over 20 pounds, and under as it's coming on and as it's initiating that boost curve, that would mean that our proportional gain is typically too high or too low. In that case, it would probably be too high. Our integral gain. Once the boost has come on and we've sort of got past the initial bit of coming on boost, in our 20 pound example, we come up, we reach 20 pounds, then it's sort of saying 18, 22, 18, 22, 18, 22, bit wavy like that. That would mean that our integral gain is typically set a little bit too high or too low. Lastly, our derivative gain. If we're targeting 20 pounds, it comes up and we sit nice and flat on just 19 pounds or just 21 pounds, we would then need to use our derivative gain to adjust for this. Now, this is a really short demonstration or short sort of description of what these values are. We could go into PID controlling forever. If you're interested in that, jump on the internet and have a look. There's a huge amount of documentation about how PID controllers work. I would really recommend having a look at that before you start going into any closed loop control strategies across any engine management system or really anything in life. We've talked about our base duty cycle that was going to be, let's say, 12% or 13% in order to achieve our target pressure of 12 psi. Now, that was just a guess. Our short-term trims are going to adjust that for me. So they're going to be going plus or minus. They're going to be making up for any of my mistakes. But you don't want them to be making up for your mistakes every single time the thing comes on boost. It'd be much better to learn from your mistake, right? That's what the long-term trims do. If we pop these ones open here, the long-term trim gain. This is how much this system is going to learn. So a typical value of 2 or 300 is about right. And I want it to learn more the further away from the target that it is. So if I'm really close to my target pressure, I don't want it to learn very much. If it's a long way away, I want it to learn aggressively so that next time it comes on boost, it's a lot more accurate. If I come down to the long-term trim table itself, it's got the same table axes as our closed loop base duty cycle table. And as we drive the car, what's going to happen is it's going to come on boost, it's going to come up to our 12 pounds. It might need a few percent duty cycle, more or less, to get there than what I've set up, depending on the day, depending on the temperature, depending on the track conditions, the intake temperatures, the turbocharger temperatures, the oil temperature, all these different things that you simply can't tune for in the day that you're on the dyno with a particular car. And that's why these strategies are so important, because now the engine management system is going to see how far from the target I was. So see how much error there was in that base duty cycle. It looks at the short-term trim and says, oh, it's doing a lot of work. It'll start filling out this table in the background in order to get us closer to our target every single time the thing comes on boost. So after setting up our start duty cycle, after setting up our target boost pressures, most of the things that I've got configured here are straight out of the base settings in the Nexus series or the Elite series ECU. They're a really good starting point. So I would suggest all you would need to do, base duty cycle and the target pressure. I'm going to give the car a run and I'm going to be logging, most importantly, the boost control output so that I can see what duty cycle the solenoid was running at, to see what manifold pressure the car had, then see if I need to make any changes. So that run shows that we've picked up a little bit of power over our base wastegate pressure, so I was excited to see that. And if I come down to our data log here, I can see that we were then targeting 14 pounds of boost pressure. If we have a look at the bottom of the screen here, boost control output, the blue one, I sort of guessed that our start duty cycle, or the duty cycle that we'd need to bleed off in order to pick up that boost pressure, was going to be about 12 or 13%, something like that. That's then, have a look up the top here, has resulted in a manifold pressure of 14.5 psi. So it's gone half a pound over what I was expecting. Then have a look at this. As we start the run, as the run starts cruising across, our short-term trim pulls out 1% of the duty cycle. It's correcting for my error. As we keep coming across, it's pulling out 1.2, 1.3%, 1.4%. Then look what happens to that yellow line there. The long-term trim has started to identify that the short-term has been pulling out 1% for long enough. It's now stepped in and it's pulling negative 0.1%. I know these are only really, really small values, but remembering we're only trimming a really small amount to try and pick up 2 pounds of boost pressure. So as we drag across, by the end of the run there, the long-term trim has pulled out negative 0.2%. Our short-term trim is pulling out negative 1.3%, which ends with an error or a target pressure of 13.8, 13.9 pounds when we're targeting 14 pounds. Got to be a bit realistic with that as well, is that think of that pneumatic system that we're trying to control there. We've got our turbochargers compressing the air, putting them through the intercooler, putting it into the engine. We've then got our combustion. That's then driving our turbochargers. Then we've got our wastegates that are flapping up and down in order to maintain that target pressure. We're simply not expecting this to be accurate to 0.1 of a PSO or 0. There's always going to be a little bit of a fluctuation there. I'm really happy with that within 0.2 PSI. I'm now going to go through, touch up the tune on this thing a little bit, tidy up some of the little bits and pieces just while it's on the dyno, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I can't handle it when our O2 trims are more than sort of 5 or 6% out. So I'm going to go through and do a little bit of that work. I'm so pleased that we could go through a little bit of the closed loop boost control strategy on this car. And hopefully now you've got a better idea of how the closed loop boost control strategy works, how the software works, and allows you to assign several functions to one particular button. That's so handy when you're trying to build a power management strategy on a car like this. Well, I know it's been another long one and another technical one and another one with heaps of laptop screens, but I really hope that you've learned something and it's given you a little bit more confident to go and start tinkering with your engine management system. Hopefully, won't be too much longer and we'll be able to take this thing out to the racetrack and do a few laps. Hopefully, Brian will be sitting in that chair and I'll be sitting in this chair. As always, thanks so much for watching. My name's Scott. Catch you next time.